December 13, 1937, a Japanese newspaper headline. Not a headline about a battle won. Not a headline about territory captured. A headline about a score. It read, "Incredible record, Mukai 1-6, Noda 1-5. Both lieutenants go into extra innings." The two men being reported on were not athletes. They were Imperial Japanese Army officers. And the number beside their names was not a sports score. It was a body count. This is the story of Toshiaki Mukai and Tsuyoshi Noda. The two officers who turned the act of killing into a competition had it covered by their own country's newspapers like a sporting event, and eventually paid for it with their lives in front of a firing squad in Nanjing, China, in January 1948. Toshiaki Mukai was born in 1912 in Yamaguchi Prefecture, Japan. Tsuyoshi Noda was born the same year in Kagoshima Prefecture. Both were the same age. Both held the same rank, second lieutenant in the Imperial Japanese Army. Both had gone through the same military training, the same academy, the same system that shaped hundreds of thousands of Japanese officers during the 1930s. In almost every measurable way, they were interchangeable. Two young officers among thousands, advancing through the ranks of an army that was, by late 1937, deep in the middle of a brutal campaign across China. Neither of them would have been remembered at all by history if not for what they decided to do, and what their own country's press decided to celebrate on the march toward Nanjing. By November 1937, Japan had fought its way through Shanghai in one of the bloodiest urban battles of the entire war. Chinese nationalist forces were in retreat. The Imperial Army was pushing hard toward the Chinese capital, Nanjing, determined to capture it and force the nationalist government to collapse. Mukai and Noda were both serving in units advancing along this same route, moving through captured city after captured city. Wuxi, Changzhou, Danyang, Zhejiang, each town falling to Japanese forces as they pushed steadily forward. And somewhere along that road, between one captured town and the next, the two officers made a bet that three Japanese war correspondents decided to cover as if it was a competition worth reporting on in the national press. The contest, the Haikunin, Girikoso, meaning literally the 100-man killing contest, was simple. Which of the two officers could be the first to kill 100 people with a sword? Starting from Wuxi on November 27, 1937, the Tokyo Nichi Shimbun and the Osaka Mainichi Shimbun began tracking their progress. The first report, published November 30, 1937, announced cheerfully, "Competition for beheading 100 enemies." Two lieutenants already got 80 people. It read more like a football score update than a war dispatch. Subsequent editions tracked the numbers with the same casual enthusiasm a sports page might use for a season standings update. Mukai 86, Noda 65, then 89 and 78. The papers even interviewed the two officers between updates. One exchange, translated and published in Western newspapers, including the Japan Advertiser at the time, reads like something from a fever dream. "Noda, hey, I got 1-5. What about you? Mukai, I got 1-6. Both men laughed. Then, because they could not determine who had reached 100 kills first, and because both had already surpassed the original target, one of them said, "Well then, since it's a drawn game, what if we start again, this time going for 150? Pause for a second and read that back. These were the words of two human beings talking about killing other human beings. And Japanese newspapers printed them as entertainment. If this is the kind of history you want more of, hit the like button right now. The question of exactly who these men killed and how has been debated by historians for decades. The officers themselves, in statements made after the war, told different stories. Noda himself, speaking to a crowd at a hero's welcome in his home province after returning from China, admitted openly, "I killed only 4 or 5 with sword in real combat." What actually happened, according to his own account, was that after capturing enemy trenches, Japanese soldiers would tell Chinese prisoners, "Ni lai lai, come here, come here." And the prisoners, not realizing what was about to happen, would come out of the trench one after another. And then, according to Noda's own words, they would line them up and cut them down from one end to the other. In other words, not heroic hand, to hand combat against enemy soldiers, as the newspapers had described. Mass executions of prisoners who had already surrendered. This distinction mattered enormously at the trial that came a decade later, and it could not be walked back. The Western press picked up the story almost immediately. The Millard's Review, a Western newspaper published in China, ran an article on January 1, 1938 with the headline, "How Lieutenants Mukai and Noda Exceeded Murder Quotas. Foreign Missionaries in Nanjing at the Time." Members of the International Safety Zone Committee that had stayed behind to protect civilians documented what they witnessed in diaries and reports that survived the war. The scale of killing those witnesses described across Nanjing in those same weeks dwarfs any individual score 2 officers might have kept. But the newspaper contest made Mukai and Noda uniquely, permanently identifiable. Their names, their faces, their scores, all preserved in print, in photographs, in 4 separate published articles that would eventually be used as evidence against them in a courtroom nearly a decade later. Japan surrendered in August 1945. The war was over. Both Mukai and Noda returned home. For a brief period, they appeared to have escaped accountability entirely, the same way so many others had. Mukai even filed a legal challenge, attempting to have the newspaper articles dismissed as inaccurate. He obtained written statements from the original journalists involved, admitting that some details in the reports had been exaggerated or inaccurate. He believed this might be enough to protect him. It was not. In 1947, a Chinese prosecution official named Gao Wenbin, secretary to Chinese prosecutor Jingzi Jun, was reviewing wartime documents and photographs. He came across the original Tokyo Nichi Shimbun photographs, the ones published in 1937, showing Mukai and Noda standing side by side holding their swords, with their names captioned directly beneath their faces. The identification was absolute. On May 8, 1947, the Chinese Commission on War Criminals formally requested that Allied forces in Tokyo extradite both men to China to face trial. The US Army arrested them and handed them over. They were brought to Nanjing, the city where their contest had played out a decade earlier, and placed on trial before the Nanjing War Crimes Tribunal. They were not tried alone. Alongside them stood Captain Gunkichi Tanaka, a third officer who, by the tribunal's accounting, had personally killed over 300 Chinese prisoners and civilians with his own sword during the Nanjing massacre. 3 men, 3 swords, 1 tribunal. The verdict was delivered on December 4, 1947. The tribunal's written judgment, translated into English, stated, "The defendants Toshiaki Mukai and Tsuyoshi Noda were accomplices in the Nanjing massacre. They continued to massacre prisoners and non-combatants, violating the Hague Regulations on Land Warfare and the Convention on the Treatment of Prisoners of War, constituting war crimes and crimes against humanity. They killed civilians for sport and used murder to compete and entertain. It was extremely cruel and unparalleled in its brutality. They were truly robbers of humanity and enemies of civilization." All 3 men were sentenced to death. Before his execution, Tsuyoshi Noda was given the opportunity to write a final letter. In it, he reportedly denied that the contest as reported by the newspapers had ever actually taken place in the way described. Whether this was a genuine claim or a last desperate attempt to change the outcome of a verdict that was already final, nobody who read that letter chose to act on it. On January 28, 1948, Mukai Toshiaki Noda Tsuyoshi and Tanaka Gunkichi were taken to the execution ground at Yuhawatai, the same mountains outside Nanjing where Hisao Tani had been executed less than a year earlier. In April 1947, all 3 were shot by firing squad. Mukai and Noda were both 35 years old. Tanaka was 42. There is a detail about what happened after the executions that many historical accounts skip over. In Japan, the story of the 100-man killing contest was almost completely forgotten after the war. It disappeared from public consciousness, buried under the weight of Japan's reconstruction and the discomfort of confronting what had happened in China. It was not until 1967, nearly 20 years after the executions, that a Japanese history professor named Tomoyo Hora published a 108-page document about the events in Nanjing that brought the story back into public view. Then, a journalist named Tsuyoshi Honda published a series of articles in the Asahi Shimbun based on interviews with Chinese survivors. And the story exploded back into the Japanese public consciousness for the first time since the war. What followed was decades of controversy, lawsuits, and a debate in Japan about historical memory and responsibility that has never been fully resolved. In 2003, the families of both Mukai and Noda filed a defamation lawsuit in Tokyo, arguing the contest had been fabricated by the media. 2 years later, in August 2005, a Tokyo district court judge dismissed the lawsuit. The judge's ruling stated plainly, the contest did occur and was not fabricated by the media. Although the original newspaper article included false elements, the officers admitted that they had raced to kill 100 people, and it is difficult to say it was fiction. Today, the Nanjing Massacre Memorial in China includes a dedicated exhibit on the 100-man killing contest among its displays. The photographs of Mukai and Noda standing with their swords, the same photographs that led directly to their identification and arrest, are among the most widely reproduced images associated with the massacre. Their names, which would have been completely forgotten by history, were preserved forever by the same newspapers that once celebrated what they did as entertainment. If you want to hear the story of the Japanese general who commanded the forces at Nanjing knew what was happening privately. He felt sorry and was executed alongside 6 others at Sugamo prison in Tokyo. That story is already on this channel. Subscribe to Ordinity so you don't miss what comes next.